How many people truly own the land they believe that they own? Across many cities, millions of naira change hands in property transactions, receipts are issued, and celebration follows. Years later, many of those owners discover something devastating. They paid for land, but they never legally owned it. Not because they were careless, not because they were not intelligent, but because they did not understand one simple legal instrument that determines whether a property transaction is real or merely hope. And that instrument is called a deed. In real estate, hope does not create ownership, but documentation does. So in this video, we'll be looking at deed as well as the types of deed. And more importantly, we'll also be looking at two critical concepts referred to as competence and capacity. So do well to watch this video to the very end. Also do well to like, drop a comment, subscribe, and share this video to people within your network. As you already know, on this channel, we do not just bring you the very best real estate investment opportunities, we also educate you on how you can safely and rightly invest using facts and data. My name is Iyayi Aibuedefe. I'm the shortest distance between you and the right real estate investment here in the city of Abuja. I help my clients build sure and sustainable wealth that is transgenerational. So let's begin with laying a proper foundation by defining what a deed is. Simply put, a deed is a formal legal document that transfers title, interest, and ownership from one party to another. So think of a deed this way: you buy a property and you pay money to the seller of that property. Legally speaking, ownership ought to also be transferred from the seller to you, and the document that proves that that transfer of ownership has been done is referred to as a deed. Like I will always maintain, there are two aspects to every successful real estate transaction. We have the transactional aspect as well as the legal aspect. The transactional aspect simply talks about the exchange of money between the buyer and the seller. In other words, the transfer of money from the buyer to the seller's account. And you know that there is always a proof that shows that that transfer has been done, and that proof is referred to as the proof of payment or receipt generated by the bank. And on the other hand, ownership right ought to be transferred from the seller to the buyer. In a nutshell, deed is a bridge between payment and ownership. And we have different types of deed depending on the type and nature of the transaction you are dealing with. The first is referred to as the deed of assignment. This is actually the most common type of deed. We also have deed of transfer, deed of conveyance, deed of confirmation, deed of partition or sharing, deed of gift, deed of mortgage, and several other types of deeds. So it is important as an investor you get to understand or get yourself familiar with these types of deed. Now let's quickly look at when is a deed becomes mandatory. In other words, there are situations and circumstances that may warrant that a deed becomes necessary. The first situation that warrant that a deed becomes mandatory is when you are creating or transferring interest in land. Whenever you are dealing with a transaction that has to do with transferring interest in land from one person to another, a deed becomes mandatory to execute that transaction. For an instance, someone gives you a land, maybe during your birthday celebration or during any celebration of yours, and at that point in time, everybody is happy and everybody is jubilating. While you sincerely thank the person for the gift, also ensure that a deed of gift is being executed to ensure that ownership flows from the person to you. In that way, the land becomes legally yours. Anything outside of this, the land does not belong to you based on the law. So you must ensure that this kind of transaction is being executed by a deed for ownership to truly flow from the donor to you. Another instance where a deed becomes mandatory is when you are leasing a property between 3 years and above. Now, generally speaking, based on the law, anything below 3 years is referred to as tenancy. Why, if it is 3 years and above, it is called a lease. So when you are leasing out a property to someone or someone is leasing out a property to you, if it is below 3 years, you don't necessarily need a deed for you to execute that transaction. A formal written document is enough to formalize that transaction. But if it is 3 years and above, it becomes paramount and very important that you execute that transaction by a deed. And the third instance where a deed is also very important is the issue of power of attorney. In other words, when you appoint a third party to act on your behalf, at that point in time, it becomes very important for that appointment to be executed by a deed. Let's say, for an instance, you want someone to help you sell a property, maybe because you are not physically present to do that transaction yourself. So for you to appoint that person to execute that transaction on your behalf, it has to be done by a deed. And the fourth circumstance or condition that warrants that a deed becomes mandatory is rectifying a deed. If there is a mistake on a deed and you need to rectify that mistake, it has to be done by another deed. For an instance, let's say you bought a piece of land and the plot size is actually 600 square meters. But when that deed was prepared, it was 500 square meters was written instead of 600 square meters. Now, you do not casually just strike out the 500 square meters and put 600 square meters. You will need another deed for that correction to be effected. Now, let's quickly look at the key components or elements that make a deed valid and enforceable. In other words, these are the elements that must be captured in a deed for that deed to be valid. The first one is the particulars of the parties. It is important that you capture the particulars of the party. Particulars in the sense that we are talking about the full names, the addresses, as well as the legal status of the parties involved, and all of these must be captured. The other component is the particulars of witnesses. Yes, a witness is very, very important if a deed is enforceable or valid or not. So you will need the full name of the witness. You also need the address of the witness, the signature of the witness, as well as the occupation of the witness. Another key component you will need to pay attention to is the description and the location of the property. The property needs to be identifiable and it has to be properly described. There is no vague description in this place. In other words, if you look at the deed, you should be able to tell where the property is with precision. And the fourth key element that must be captured in a deed is the history of title. Here we are referring to the researcher. In other words, we are talking about the chronological story of how the land moved from the first owner of the land to the present owner. If there is any break in the link of this chain, there is serious problem and you have to pay close attention to it. And the fifth key element that must be captured in a deed is the consideration. The consideration simply talks about the value exchanged for the property. Now, it is mostly money, but it is not limited or restricted to money. It could be anything. For instance, someone may have rendered a service to you and you need to actually reward that person with a property. At that point in time, the service becomes the consideration for that property and it has to be well captured in the deed. And the sixth core element that needs to be captured in a deed is covenant and undertaking. Now, these are specific conditions tied to the property you are buying. It is important to pay attention to this. For an instance, you will see that it is being written, it is for residential purpose only. In other words, any commercial development is not welcome in that property. So you need to pay attention to that. And the seventh element that must be captured in a deed is the capacity of the party giving interest. Now, this answer the question, does this person actually have the legal right to sell? There are two concepts under this that every investor must pay attention to and understand. The first is competence and the other is capacity. Now, when we talk about competence, competence is having authority but without ability. In other words, you are truly the owner of the property, but you don't have the ability or you are not legally competent to execute that transaction. For an instance, if a minor owns a property that he inherited from his father, Even though he legally owned that property, he is not legally competent enough to execute that transaction, because based on the law, he cannot execute that transaction because of his age. So at that point in time, if you buy that property from that person, that property can be challenged in the court of law, because based on the law, he is not of age to execute that property. In other words, he cannot transfer interest to you. And the next concept is capacity. This is ability without authority. So in this case, the person have the original documents of the paper, but does not possess the legal rights or the authority to sell that property, because you cannot give what you don't have. For you to be able to sell that property or legally be able to transfer ownership to another person, you need to first of all legally own that property. A vivid example is, let's say a spouse dies and the partner picks up the original document to go and sell the property. Based on the law, the partner cannot sell that property because that property does not originally belong to the partner. The fact that a person possesses the original document of a property does not legally give the person the right or the authority to transfer ownership to another person. So as an investor, you need to be very, very careful with this kind of scenario. And the eighth and last core element that must be captured in a deed for a deed to be valid and enforceable is the quantum of interest transferred. This refers to the exact portion of land that is being transferred. It has to be specific. Is it 500 square meters? Is it 1,000 square meters? Is it 100 by 100? It has to be specific. So the next time you want to buy a property from someone, while you transfer money from your account to that person, in order for that transaction to be complete and successful, also ensure that the person properly transfer ownership to you through a deed. When all of this is being done, it will be difficult for you to be scammed in every real estate transaction that you execute. Once again, my name is Iyayi Ibuedefi. I'm the shortest distance between you and the right real estate investment here in the city of Abuja. I help my clients build sure and sustainable wealth that is transgenerational. So if you are yet to like, drop a comment, subscribe to this YouTube channel, kindly do so. And until I come your way in our next video, see you on the other side of it. Bye for now.